it like being a Beatle in those days?
Well, just the same as I feel now, downhearted. You know, we weren't making any headway at the time, like.
Do you ever think about what you've missed?
Oh, aye. Wouldn't anybody, you know. Yeah.
From 1960 to 1964, a total of 8 drummers sat behind the Beatles' drum set. Some were pushed out, others turned the band down flat, and one became a Beatle at the height of their fame, only to hand the seat back after 13 days.
I can never make up for what Ringo is, you know.
This is the story of all the people who sat behind the Beatles' drum kit. Since the very beginning, the drums presented problems for the Beatles.
We used to show up for gigs with just 3 guitars, and the person booking us would say, "Where's the drums then?" And to cover this eventuality, we say, "The rhythm's in the guitars."
The Beatles were that naive in those days that they thought they didn't need a drummer, that the bass player would substitute.
And then we had all sorts of different drummers all the time, because people who owned drum kits were far and few between. It was an expensive item, and they were usually idiots, you know.
Tommy Moore was a forklift driver who briefly played drums for the Beatles in May and June 1960. Tommy played with the band on their audition for British pop manager Larry Parnes, which took them on a tour of Scotland backing pop singer Johnny Gentle.
And the drummer he got was a guy called Tommy Moore, who was 10 years older than any of them. So there was a generation gap. He was a very good drummer, but John used to crucify him with his sarcastic wit.
During the tour, they had an accident with their van.
And they crashed into a car. All the lads were in the back of the van, and this guitar case slid with the impact and hit poor Tommy Moore right in the mouth and knocked all his front teeth out. So he was taken to hospital, which John Lennon thought was hilarious.
Moore was lying in a hospital bed, sedated with a stitched lip, but John Lennon still dragged him out to play that evening's gig.
John Lennon was in hysterics seeing this poor lad in agony playing with his mouth all strapped up and bandaged. At the end of the tour, Tommy came home on his own, cursing and saying that he'd never ever play with the Beatles again.
When Tommy Moore had auditioned with the Beatles for Larry Parnes, he arrived late, so they had to ask a drummer from another group to start off the audition. Johnny Hutchinson was the drummer for the Liverpool groups Cass and the Casanovas, and later, the Big Three. He was considered one of the top local musicians.
I mean, why did they pick me? I mean, what's that? There was other drummers, you know, Johnny Hutch. I mean, I like to talk about Johnny Hutch. There were 2 drummers in Liverpool, and Johnny Hutch was the other one.
Johnny sat in for the Larry Parnes audition, playing with a look of pure boredom until Tommy Moore arrived. 2 years later, the Beatles would need him again. Drummerless, right before Ringo joined, they played a gig in August 1962. And since the Big Three were also on the bill, Johnny Hutchinson sat for them one more time, certain he was doing them a massive favor. So when Brian Epstein offered him the job for good, he turned it down flat. "I told Brian I wouldn't join the Beatles for a gold clock," he said. Going back to the summer of 1960, right after Tommy Moore had quit, the Beatles were in desperate need of a drummer.
I then thought the Beatles were ready to go and be professional. But unfortunately, we'd lost Tommy Moore. One night we were all in the Jacaranda with the Beatles, and we could hear this drummer practicing. And this young lad, Norman Chapman, he was rehearsing there. And we said, "Norman, would you like to be our drummer for the Beatles?" And he said, "Yes, he'd love to."
Around the time the first Hamburg contract was being arranged, Chapman officially joined the group for a short run.
But what he didn't tell us that he couldn't go to Hamburg because he was being called up for conscription. So Norman Chapman, who was a very, very good drummer, unfortunately for his career, he had to go in the army.
Every time the Beatles were left without a drummer, there was one member in the front line who was always expected to pick up the sticks.
And then we were all saying, what the hell are we going to do? We've got no drummer.
At that point, Paul was the drummer because all the drummers didn't show up.
Now, I'm not technically a very good drummer, but sort of bop, bop, that kind of stuff I love to do.
Paul actually hated the role. He felt relegated in the back and strongly believed his rightful place was at the front of the stage with his guitar. As their first trip to Hamburg closed in on them, the drummer problem needed a solution.
Alan Williams came to us and said, "Okay, lads, you can have this job in Germany. The only problem is you've got to be 5 people." He's asked for a 5-piece band.
Just 2 days before leaving for Germany, the Beatles found their drummer.
Now, the Beatles were going through one of their drummerless periods. They had been playing at the Cashbar Club run by a Mrs. Best, whose son was Pete Best, who played drums.
Oh, that's when I said, okay, I remember this guy who went up to this club and they were going to, Pete Best, and he had this drum kit for Christmas.
He was known on Merseyside as mean, moody, and magnificent.
And I got the phone call from Paul McCartney, and he turned around and said, "I'd like to speak to Pete." Which lad of 18 gets the chance to go to Germany and play rock and roll music with a rock band?
We did a quick audition with him and jumped in the van and went to Hamburg.
There was great excitement getting into the van. So there was the 5 of us, Steve Sutcliffe, George Harrison, Paul McCartney, John Lennon and Pete Best, the Beatles.
Pete played on 3 of their legendary Hamburg trips. He endured the exhausting 8-hour stage sessions and the gritty chaos of the red light district. This was the crucible where the Beatles forged their act.
So we went from being be quite honest, a very mediocre rock and roll band, okay, to this tight, frenetic, wild, savage sounding Beatles, a great rock band. And this was because of the playing relentlessly every night.
Pete Best was there through all of it. The dance halls, the growing crowds across Liverpool and the towns beyond, and the residency at the Cavern. He was dependable. He even handled the band's bookings before Brian Epstein took over. He played the drums for the Decca audition, and on the tapes Epstein carried around London, from one record label to the next. When those tapes finally got to George Martin at EMI, the Beatles met the man who would give them their big break.
But when we went to do a record deal, George Martin wasn't that impressed with Pete. It was sad, really,
On the verge of the contract that would change their lives forever, Pete Best was cut off.
And I was aware that the band weren't tight. They needed that sort of binding force that a good drummer should give them. So I said to Brian, well, I'll get another drummer for the recording sessions. You can do what you like with him on stage, but we'll have someone else on the tracks. And I didn't realise until afterwards that they'd been thinking the same thing anyway.
And in August, around about the 15th of August, I was called into Brian Epstein's office. Played the night before, the Cavern. And I got into the office. Brian wasn't his normal, cool, calm, placid self, And he basically talked around the subject for a while and then turned around very apologetically. Pete, he said, I have bad news for you. He said, the boys want you out. And it's been arranged that Ringo will join the band on Saturday. And of course, that was the bombshell, because I'd had no forewarning at all about this. All this had been going on behind closed doors.
By then, we were pretty sick of Pete Best, too, because he was a lousy drummer. He never improved, And there was always this myth being built up over the years that he was great and Paul was jealous of him because he was pretty and all that crap, And the reason he got in the group in the first place was because the only way we could get to Hamburg, we had to have a drummer.
But when the reality of the situation hit me, and I got home, I, be honest, I cried. I broke down. I'd put 2 years of my life into this band. And basically on the cusp of just, first record release, which we hoped was going to do great for us, it was snatched from me.
Historically, it may look like we did something nasty to Pete, and it may have been that we could have done it better. But the thing was, as history also shows, Ringo was the member of the band. It's just that he didn't enter the film until that particular scene, you know?
We really started to think we needed the great drummer in Liverpool. And the great drummer in our eyes was this guy called Ringo Starr.
But before Ringo could claim his place in the recording studio, there would be yet another drummer. On September 11th, 1962, session drummer Andy White was brought in for the recording of what would be their first single, Love Me Do.
What actually happened was that when Ringo came to the session for the first time, nobody told me that he was coming. I'd already booked Andy White, and I told Brian Epstein I was going to do this. I said, I just want the three others, and that's fine.
And he didn't like me, of course. He wanted a professional drummer.
Ringo turns up expecting to play. I said, well, no, I've been bitten once. I'm not going to have that. I don't even know you are. We're going to have Andy White, thank you very much.
No, I was devastated. I came down ready to roll, and we've got Andy White, the professional drummer. But he's apologized several times since, as old George Martin. But it was devastating. And then we did that, which Andy plays on, and then we did the album, which I play on.
Oh, Ringo to this day bears those scars. He says, you know, you didn't let me play, did you?
Ringo did play, eventually. The final Beatles lineup was in place.
And we'd seen Ringo, and we really admired Ringo. We actually thought Ringo was the best drummer in Liverpool. And then the first night we played with Ringo, just something clicked, you know, and we're all like looking back and going, ooh, looking at each other going, oh, something's happening.
Ringo kept sitting in with the band, and every time Ringo sat in with the band, it just seemed like this was it.
When Ringo finally sat behind the drum kit at the Cavern Club, the crowd reaction was intense and highly divided.
Then the Saturday night we played at the Cavern, and half the room went to the left and half went to the right. They divided, you know, because they all knew me, and when I sat in it was fine, there was never any bother. But now, I mean, it was the biggest news in Liverpool, you know. Pete's out, Ringo's in, you know, Ringo never, Pete forever. It just got crazy out there.
Brian Epstein wrote in his book, "The sacking of Pete left me in an appalling position in Liverpool. Overnight, I became the most disliked man on the seething beat scene."
We just kind of fell in love with Ringo's drumming. Ringo was in another band, and we used to go see this other band. We said, God, that drummer's good. Right. And one night, Pete couldn't do it, and Ringo sat in for him, and we all just went, yeah. Behind us was this powerhouse.
Ringo gets a particular sound out of his drums, which is all Ringo, and I don't know anybody else who gets that particular sound. So that's one of the reasons why I think he's great. He is extremely distinctive.
Brian Epstein would say, Ringo's coming into the group was one of the Beatles' most brilliant doings. It was largely George Harrison's doing. He insisted more than anyone on getting Ringo to join. The way the Beatles came together has a name, the chain. John brought in Paul, Paul brought in George, and George brought in Ringo. It rolls off the tongue naturally. John, Paul, George, and Ringo. Well, except for 13 days in 1964, when they were John, Paul, George, and Jimmy.
Jimmy Nicol, standing in for drummer Ringo Starr, who's sick at home, must be wondering what's hit him. Don't worry, he'll get used to it. He'll have to.
Jimmy played 8 concerts across Denmark, the Netherlands, Hong Kong, and Australia. His time with the Beatles was short-lived. And once Ringo recovered from his illness, Jimmy was bid farewell.
What do you feel you're taking back with you apart from experience?
Oh, damn, that's a hard question.
While Pete Best lost the seat just before fame arrived, Jimmy Nicol tasted fame at its peak and had to give it up just as fast. He was sure it would launch his career. It didn't. Band after band came and went. The hits never followed, and within a few years, he was bankrupt. Looking back, he put it plainly. Standing in for Ringo was the worst thing that ever happened to me. After the headlines died, I began dying too. And then, he simply vanished. It took many men for John, Paul, and George to find Ringo. The last piece of the Fab Four was the hardest to place. It also took a heavy emotional toll on those who were left behind, watching from the sidelines.
What job did you do immediately after you left the Beatles?
Buy back a bottle wicks. Down some bottle wicks.
The bottle work?
Yeah.
What job were you doing?
Forklift driver.
In time, though, even the deepest wounds can heal, and none ran deeper than the one carried by Pete Best.
And he phoned me and he turned around and said, Pete, he said, they are thinking about using some of your old material on the Anthology 1. So at that stage, he turned around and said, you will get an offer from Apple. Okay, the offer from Apple came, and it was great. After God knows how many years, 62 to 1990, or 94, 95, you know, I got some royalties from work I'd done with the Beatles. You know, being on about 9 or 10 tracks out of Anthology 1 was, you know, pretty good slice for me to, you know, lay my claim for the work I'd done with them. I'd worked hard, you know, done my own thing, you know, provided for my family, you know, very proud of the fact that you'd, you know, bought your own house and all this type of stuff and raised a family without my kids even knowing for a very, very long time who I was. We were comfortable, but, you know, with the royalties which accrued from the Anthology 1, it put me in a safe zone. Okay, so, you know, I'd say thank you very much for that opportunity. But it's a hell of a legacy, you know, and it's wonderful for me to have been a small part of that.